Confronted with certain aspects of Neanderthal, of the Neanderthal archaeological record, you scratch your head because you say, I don't understand. I wouldn't have done it that way. Why didn't they do it this way?
Neanderthal tools were very different to ours in one crucial respect. Everything was much simpler. And above all, unlike the modern humans, there was no Neanderthal art. And so, no evidence these primitive humans could actually think.
Neanderthals don't seem to have produced anything that we would really call art. They don't seem to have produced personal ornaments. They were, in fact, truly primitive people. Sure, they were human, they just weren't modern human.
And so archaeologists put together a theory to explain their disappearance. 40,000 years ago, modern humans arrived in Europe and suddenly started to think. This gave them a unique advantage over the Neanderthals. In the battle for the scarce resources left by the Ice Age, brains won out over brawn, as our superior minds allowed us to defeat our physically tougher neighbors.
One population capable of communicating better, capable of inventing better, capable of organizing better, in the face of a population that had none of that in their 300,000-year tradition, it seems to me that the competition would not have lasted very long.
Unable to think like us, the apparently inferior Neanderthals were pushed to the brink of extinction until, finally, they vanished altogether. This, then, was the final proof of the power of the human revolution. That sudden dawning of thought had allowed us to surpass even our nearest relatives. The human revolution had given us the power to take over the world. But then the mutterings started. A strange anomaly emerged that didn't quite fit with the human revolution story. It began when scientists started looking for the first traces of that other supposed proof of thinking. Not art, but language. It was Jeffrey Lateman who started the confusion. He's an expert in anatomy, and in particular, one small part of the human body. The part we use to speak, the throat.
The throat is arguably the most important region in all of human anatomy and physiology. As a native New Yorker, I like to think of this as the grand central station of the human body. These are really nice. This is a really clear picture.
Lateman began studying the human voice box, or larynx. He discovered that in the course of evolution, our larynx had moved to a very different position to that of all other mammals.
Something has happened in you and me. And what's happened has been rather remarkable. Our larynx has descended in the throat. One key gain, of course, is that by the larynx being lower in the throat, you have space above it. So what we get in the deal is a mechanism which has turned us sound-wise and turned us vocal-wise from being a bugle to being a trumpet. Around the pyramid.
Yeah,
Which one am I following
Start with
through?
the cat again, I guess.
Beautifully here, beautifully.
What the lower larynx gives us is the ability to speak.
The upper clip is over here. Right, you can see it clearly on the upper.
So Lateman started to wonder, when did this lowering of the larynx actually happen? When did we acquire this ability to speak? His research revealed that over the course of millions of years of evolution, the shape of our skulls had changed in a way that had caused the larynx to descend.
The big difference is when you find adult humans. When you look at the bottom of their skulls, you see a little valley, a gully, which is very different. And the relationship we found was that skulls that are very bent-bottomed, like this, relate to a larynx not positioned high on up, but a larynx that has gone much further down.
The gully-shaped skull went hand in hand with the ability to speak. So Lateman began to investigate. When had this key development needed for language actually happened? Looking at skulls from further and further back in time, he found something deeply puzzling.
By the time of early members of our own species, Homo sapiens, some 100 to 200,000 years before the present, we start to see features that are almost identical to living humans.
The modern gully shape, and so the ability to speak, had been reached at least 200,000 years ago, long before the human revolution.
So, they had the anatomy for it. Were they speaking like us? Now we get into the world of hypothesizing. I wasn't there. However, if you have a car that has a nice big engine and all the tires, you assume that car is going to run, and it's going to run pretty fast. Otherwise, why does it have that big engine? And why does it have all those nice tires? That's what we're dealing with.
And then in Israel, something happened to thicken the plot even further. In 1989, an archaeological site yielded for the first time a tiny and precious piece of a Neanderthal skeleton called the hyoid bone.
Well, the hyoid bone is a bone in your vocal tract, and it sits about here. And if you press with your fingers, you can actually feel the shape of the bone.
Just as in modern humans, the Neanderthal hyoid would have been crucial in forming the larynx. For the first time, scientists could compare our ability to make sounds with the Neanderthals. And they were in for a surprise. The hyoid bones were virtually identical.
The relationship between the hyoid bone and the cranial base and the face and the skull is the same in the Neanderthals as it is in modern humans. And the implication of that is that the hyoid bone is going to sit in the same place as it does in modern humans. It's going to be low in the throat.
In other words, like modern humans, the Neanderthals had a low larynx. It meant they too would have been physically capable of speech. In fact, in some ways, they might even have done it better.
The thing about the Neanderthals is that although they would have had a similar sort of vocal tract to ours, there were differences in the Neanderthals. They've got great big chests, they've got huge noses and massive sinuses. Now, the big chest and large nose is going to give them a much bigger sound, much more in common perhaps with an opera singer than with an ordinary person.
There was now a clear paradox. The human revolution theory said we only learned to think 40,000 years ago. And the proof of that was the sudden appearance of art in Europe. But according to the fossils, that other apparent proof of thought, speech, had emerged 160,000 years earlier. It just didn't make sense. For supporters of the human revolution theory like Richard Klein, there was now a real difficulty. How to reconcile the contradictory evidence of the art and the anatomy. So Klein proposed a radical theory. Even if humans had the anatomy for speech much earlier, they didn't have the ability to use it. Then, in contrast to every other process in evolution, where change happens gradually, the human mind had been switched on suddenly, through a single freak genetic mutation. Only then did we start to think, to talk, and to create art.
I think that what happened 40 or 50,000 years ago was that there was a genetic mutation that allowed people to be very much more creative than they had been before, to think differently, to ask questions about, what if I make my tools this way? What will be the result, in a way that no one had been able to do before?
According to Klein, thought had not emerged through gradual evolution, but in a sudden, dramatic leap forward. It was as if we'd been genetically touched by God. For Klein, this sudden awakening was so powerful, it was the only possible explanation for why we'd replaced the Neanderthals. We had the thinking genes, and they didn't. It was a bold hypothesis and a compelling one. The human revolution theory remained the best explanation of the day we learned to think. But then, in the year 2000, on the other side of the world from Europe, in Africa, came something utterly unexpected. At Blombos, on the east coast of South Africa, anthropologist Chris Henshelwood had been quietly excavating his prehistoric cave for over a decade.
This is Blombos Cave, a very special find. We're really looking at what has been left here, almost as though it was put down here yesterday.
As they dug down through the floor of the cave, his team were going back to an ancient time of human habitation, tens of thousands of years ago.
We came down onto this layer you can see over here, which really was quite remarkable. On the surface were lying the most beautifully made artifacts, bone points, spear points as well, and immediately I realized we'd gone back a very, very long way in time.
The beautifully crafted objects were dated to over 70,000 years ago. long before the human revolution. But there was still no proof the people in the cave were thinking people like us.